Finding great candidates to hire can be like, well, trying to find a needle in a haystack. Sure, you can post your job to some job board, but then all you can do is hope the right person comes along. Which is why you should try ZipRecruiter for free at ziprecruiter.com/zip. ZipRecruiter doesn't depend on candidates finding you. It finds them for you. Its powerful technology identifies people with the right experience and actively invites them to apply to your job. You get qualified candidates fast. So while other companies might deliver a lot of hay, ZipRecruiter finds you what you're looking for. The needle in the haystack.
See why 4 out of 5 employers who post a job on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free. That's right, free at ziprecruiter.com/zip. That's ziprecruiter.com/zip. ziprecruiter.com/zip.
A warmer from the low. Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Cups to Cups Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiP Family Podcast. We've got a great podcast today as we've got Tristan Freeman aboard. He does such an excellent job over at Bustin' Brackets. We're going to be talking about a wide variety of different topics with him. We're going to be touching upon a lot of the higher mid-majors. Which of these teams that are outside the Power 5 could be able to make a big charge, could be able to make the top 25? What do we make out of the Mountain West? A conference I just did a conference preview of, I believe, 24 to 48 hours ago, depending upon when you're listening to this podcast. So we're going to be talking about them. We're going to be talking quite a bit about the Atlantic 10, the way that this conference is locked and loaded with a lot of teams that probably aren't going to be able to vie for an NCAA tournament bid, but are going to be top 75 teams as well. And just the way that these teams are ticked, the way that these teams have been utilizing the transfer portal, and so much more. So we've got a great podcast today, and if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Go Soups, you're able to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. And if you do have a question, comment, segment idea, whatever for this podcast, you have one of two ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at gunit_81. Keep in mind, letters CM, they mean does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And while I did not get in any Twitter/X questions today, everything is powered by Edge Boost. Over at Edge Boost, they're making sure that bettors are able to have access to their funds whenever and wherever. 100% of gambling transactions do get approved. And when you go to edgeboost.bet, put in that promo code of Greg, G-R-E-G. That'll get you a dollar for dollar match on your first deposit up to $25. And Tristan doing such a tremendous job over at Bustin' Brackets. But on top of that, he also does some work with the Field of 68, Sleepers Media, so much more. Wealth of knowledge when it comes to college basketball. You're able to follow him on the old Twitter/X at hoopsnut351 altogether. And Tristan, always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate you having me on again, Greg.
Always appreciate you, Tristan. And Tristan, I know you're doing such a great job of getting set for the upcoming college basketball season, and you're out there in the city of Pittsburgh, so you do a great job of covering all those teams. And one of the main conferences that you take a look at is the Atlantic 10, and this is going to be a little bit of a different sort of question for you, but how big of a step down in competition do you feel like it's going to be for UMass this year, who last year they were in the Atlantic 10, this year they're in the MAC, as compared to a season ago? Because I think that they're one of the interesting teams in all of college basketball, and I do think that with this day and age of conference realignment, their move to the MAC went a little bit under the radar.
Yeah, there are some similarities with the MAC and the A10 that there's a clear top tier. So while, Dayton, VCU, Loyola, Chicago were top 100, even top 50 teams, the MAC doesn't necessarily have those, but Akron, Kent State, Ohio, and Toledo, the usual suspects at the top, they're still top 100 quality themselves, and they're going to be really good teams and probably on paper better than UMass. I think the one difference, though, is that the bottom of the MAC has some of the worst teams in the country, usually with Northern Illinois and Central Michigan and Eastern Michigan, even though the Eagles, were a bit better last year. The bottom of the MAC is definitely worse than the A10, so I do think that there's an opportunity for UMass to rack up some wins. But, in a definite one-bid league where it's ultimately going to come down in March, UMass is going to struggle to sort of creep into that top tier, making their path to get to the tournament probably even harder than it was in the A10 days.
Yep, and I do think that that is going to be so interesting to take a look at. And we know that we've had a lot of conference realignment over these last few years. And how do you take a look at some of these teams that aren't a little bit of a new conference this year? Because obviously there's much less than there was last year. Last year with the Pac-12 breaking down, it was all sorts of chaos. But obviously, Grand Canyon moving on to the Mountain West is a big one. We just talked about UMass, and you've got a few teams that are like entering into the Division 1 ranks. Like you're going to have the NEC have a team or two that comes up from the Division 2 level. That's going to be interesting as well. And I always think that these are some of the most interesting case studies in all of college basketball because it feels like they either really exceed expectations or they fall incredibly short with not a lot of in between.
Yeah, shout out to New Haven, who is going to
Yeah.
be their first year in the D1 ranks and they're hosting Penn State. And that just feels like an upset storyline waiting to happen. But besides them, I mean, you mentioned Grand Canyon going to the Mountain West. This is the last big year for the conference before half the league goes into the new Pac-12. I do think it's going to be a bit harder for Grand Canyon to sort of get into that top tier where San Diego State, Utah State, and Boise State's going to remain. But, the conference lost a lot of talent. And it's a league that's shown that it can get 3-4 plus bids. And Grand Canyon, who got, fairly solid roster despite losing so much, I do think they can make a push for a top half finish. And if that happens, sort of set the stages for being one of the top teams in the new look Mountain West years from now.
Yes, absolutely. And I do think that that's going to be one of the most interesting storylines in all of college basketball, as we do have Tristan Freeman, who does such great work over at Boston Brackets, joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And as we know, one of the big ticket items in the Pac-12 next year is a team that is currently not in the Mountain West. That would actually be Gonzaga. And how do you take a look at them for the upcoming season? Because with Gonzaga, I feel like there's been a little bit less fanfare and a little bit less hubbub than what we've seen in past years. But a guy in Ty Grant Foster, who he's currently with Gonzaga, he was with Grand Canyon, ironically enough, last season. He's a guy that's going to be coming over, had the yips with his three-point shooting, but a guy that has a lot of ability. And I take a look at this Gonzaga team in general, and I do think that it's interesting with a little bit of a changing of the guard in the backcourt.
Yeah, I mean, arguably your most important players have some level of question marks. So obviously, you bring back Graham Ike and Braden Huff is one of the best front courts in the country, but there's a lot of intriguing X factors. You have Steele Venters, who's the former Big Sky Player of the Year at Eastern Washington, has missed the last 2 years with leg injuries, so we'll see what kind of impact he has. And then Brayton Smith, who was the Patriot League Player of the Year at Colgate, he redshirted last year, but he's going to be the new starting point guard. And then you have Mario St. Supri, one of the top international players out of Spain. He's someone that there's a lot of hype for. And if he's one of the top international newcomers, then all of a sudden Gonzaga's backcourt isn't going to miss a beat. And then you mentioned, Tyler Grant Foster. He's still not technically eligible yet. He's looking for a waiver from the NCAA and has yet to hear back from that because, he's technically run out of eligibility. So who knows how that will work, because I think his issue has to deal with the clock and, how many years he had to, they get play 5. So that's a question mark in itself. But obviously Gonzaga has one of the highest floors in the country over the past 20 years. They're going to be ranked. They're going to be good. But there's a nice, variance of how high their ceiling can be. It could be Final Four good, depending on how the newcomers work. Or they could be sort of similar to last year, where they're a good, not great team, get in the tournament, but could be very matchup depending on how far they advance.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned that with Gonzaga as well, because that's one of the big things I think gets lost by a lot of people when it comes to looking forward to the upcoming season. Some of these guys that didn't play the season before, like you mentioned Braden Smith coming on over from Colgate. You mentioned the fact that Steele Venters missed the last 2 seasons. And I take a look at a team like Boise State with Tom Parolin missing all of last year due to injury, guy that comes over from the Patriot League. And I don't think he's going to be like some 15-10 guy for Boise State or anything like that, but he's another guy that is intriguing. And are there a few other teams that you take a look at that they maybe had a few pieces that were out last year? Maybe we're all forgetting about them, but they have a lot of upside based on how those guys come back this year.
Yeah, San Diego State was a team that had arguably their best guard on paper coming in last year out in Reese Waters. He ended up missing a year with the lower leg injury. He's someone who's a proven scorer, proven shot maker. And they bring back several other guards as well. So, obviously the big storyline was them being able to bring back, Magoo Guap, star center, but they also brought back Miles Bird and BJ Davis as well. So, and they added, Sean Newman, the top tier passer from Louisiana Tech. If Reese Waters is healthy and gives them, great scoring production, now all of a sudden they're a top 10, top 25, so to speak, caliber team and the easy favorite in Mountain West.
Yeah, with San Diego State, I actually just did my Mountain West preview. I put them number 1 overall. I know that our good friend Sean Paul thinks that they've got the potential to perhaps be a top 25 team. I do think that they have a lot of upside as well. And when you take a look at these mid-major teams, I know you do a great job covering the Atlantic 10. I think we're both in agreement that VCU might have that top 25 potential in them. We just talked about San Diego State. Is there maybe another 1 or 2 teams that are outside the power conference ranks that might have that potential to be able to bust through, be a top 25 team, maybe like a 28-plus win team?
Well, I think probably the easiest answer would be Memphis. They're a team that, lost Dane Danger. They lost, Conference Player of the Year, PJ Haggerty. But they had a solid offseason when it comes to just raw talent. Doug McDaniel is a proven scorer at a high major level. Quante Berry is a proven American scorer as well. Sincere Parker can put up buckets. And it's going to come down to Aaron Bradshaw, a former 5-star prospect out of Ohio State / Kentucky. If he, finally breaks out and has, the big kind of year that, we think he can, at least offensively, then they're going to be just as potent as they won last year. And again, the American, everyone lost talent effectively outside of South Florida, who probably is their biggest threat. But, a team outside the power leagues, and again, they also have another top tier non-con schedule. I think Memphis might not have the kind of step back as I think many think they can. But again, it's going to be dependent on what Bradshaw does because they don't have a lot of front court depth at the moment.
Yep, and with Aaron Bradshaw, he's got so much upside, a guy that stands over 7 feet tall, but just has never really been able to put it together. He's had a few off-the-court issues as well, so that's going to be an interesting team to be taking a look at, as we do have Tristan Freeman, who does such great work over at Bustin' Brackets, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, and Tristan is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the Atlantic 10, so how about if we talk about that conference on the flip side? I feel like there's 6 or 7 teams in this conference that could be like top 75, top 80 teams when it's all said and done. Also, just ask him, in his opinion, if there's a team or two that he's feeling relatively bullish on as well. So that's coming up on the flip side right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now a part of the Decent Family Podcast.
Warning, the following ZipRecruiter radio spot you are about to hear is going to be filled with F words.
When you're hiring, we at ZipRecruiter know you can feel frustrated, forlorn even, like your efforts are futile, and you can spend a fortune trying to find fabulous people, only to get flooded with candidates who are just fine. Fortunately, ZipRecruiter figured out how to fix all that. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. With ZipRecruiter, you can forget your frustrations because we find the right people for your roles fast, which is our absolute favorite F word. In fact, 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day.
Fantastic.
So, whether you need to hire 4, 40, or 400 people, get ready to meet first-rate talent. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/zip to try ZipRecruiter for free. Don't forget, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip. Finally, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip.
And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. Always great to be joined by Tristan Freeman. He does such a tremendous job over at Bustin' Brackets, taking a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. He's dialed into a little bit of everything, as he heard in the first part of that conversation. You're able to follow him on the old Twitter/X at HoopsNut351. And Tristan, we were talking a little bit before about some of these mid-major teams, and how about if we focus on a conference that you know very well, being based out there in the lovely city of Pittsburgh? That'd be the Atlantic 10. I do think that even though VCU had the coaching change in the offseason, they did a great job with Phil Martelli Jr. coming in. They've got a couple top 150 recruits coming in. They did a nice job via the transfer portal, but I think that this is a conference that when it's all said and done, they have the potential to have maybe even like 7 top 100, top 110 teams when it's all said and done, because I do think that after VCU, there's a little bit of step down, but those teams like Loyola Chicago, George Mason, George Washington, St. Louis, if they could put it all together, I do think that these are all teams that are going to be fighting neck and neck for those number 2 and number 3 spots.
I do think, despite, many teams losing talent, I do think teams like George Mason, St. Joe's, obviously GW, and even a team like Davidson, despite losing, a couple all-conference players, they did fairly well in the transfer portal. And then Dayton and VCU are just too big to fail at this point, regardless of which players leave and whoever they get in the portal. I do think that they're going to be good enough as well. And the conference overall did a fairly good job in the portal. It's just ultimately going to come down to how they look in non-con play. And St. Louis was a team who, brings back, their star big man, but they have a fairly weak non-con schedule. They were going to have to go, I'd say 12-1 if they went at-large hopes, but that could be difficult to do. I think some of the teams schedule harder. Obviously, VCU and Dayton consistently schedules well, and some of the other teams don't really. But, depending on how the league does in the non-con, it's going to determine how many bids they can get. And I do think it can be, it could be a team that gets 2 to 3 bids. But again, it'll come down to how strong, the perennial heavyweights, VCU and Dayton.
Yep, absolutely. And I do think that for Dayton, it's a little bit of a question mark as to what we're going to be able to get out of them this year, because last year I thought was a disappointment for Dayton, because you bring in some big time name guys, because I really thought that with bringing in a guy in Zed Key, who is a starter over at Ohio State, Posh Alexander, who obviously started for many, many years out there in the Big East, that those guys were going to have an impact. They didn't have quite the impact that I was expecting. They don't have quite the big names that are coming in this year. You're bringing a Deshaun Montgomery from the MAAC, Jordan Durcock, who we remember him over at Merrimack a few seasons ago. But I do think that in this case, these guys might fit the system a little bit better, whereas perhaps last year they got too big of names, guys that didn't necessarily fit the system, and it made them a little bit frustrated when things didn't go their way.
Yeah, and the thing with guys, transferring down, there's always going to be an expectation of minutes in a role. And you mentioned, Posh Alexander not having a big year. Javon Bennett, who came from, I believe, Merrimack, I think he ended up just simply outplaying him, and now he's going to be the go-to guy. But there's a lot of underclassmen transfers as well, guys who didn't have the largest roles before, such as, Malcolm Thomas coming over from Villanova for Dayton. VCU got Ahmad Noel, former top 100 guy, UConn. These guys are more the breakout candidates to watch because they didn't necessarily get large roles at the previous stop, but it doesn't mean that they're not talented. So going down and having, more of a role could give them an opportunity to shine. And if you can, Nate Santos, formerly of Pitt, ended up being a good example for that because he goes to Dayton and ends up being an all-league player for them. So if you can just get the right gem, it can be the difference between you being top half team in the league and being one of the favorites to win the postseason tournament.
Oh, no question about it. And I do think that this Dayton team is going to be one of fascination just because you don't necessarily have as much sizzle as you had 8 seasons ago, but you might have a little bit more stake. And when I take a look at this team, I think that they're one of the most interesting as well. And that'd be Loyola Chicago, because it felt like they just had a little bit of an inconsistent up and down year last year. But I really love the fact that they brought in Dominic Harris, one of the more underrated guards in the transfer portal this offseason. Will Tavares, he had a really nice year over at Charleston as well. And with Loyola Chicago, they had so many backcourt injuries last season that I think a lot of people lose sight of. And bringing in someone like a Joseph Ala Joseph, bringing back Miles Rubin, I feel like Loyola Chicago might have one of their most complete teams in quite some time. Maybe not Sweet 16 good unlike a few seasons ago, but I look at this Loyola Chicago team and I really like the way that they're built for this upcoming season.
The point guard play was really hurt for the Ramblers when Justin Moore went down, but he's going to be back, and him being healthy, I think is going to really turn around their offense, along with having the transfers that you mentioned. But the most important thing for them was that they brought back Miles Rubin, one of the best interior defenders in the country. And if he just continues to develop, he can have a huge junior year and, a favorite to win Conference Player of the Year. And if that happens and the shooting on the team is good, then there's a legit chance that they can win the A-10, because he can have not the same kind of, dominant impact that Deron Holmes and they can have, but When you have an elite big in this conference, as we saw Jalen Haynes, what he was able to do for George Mason, that instantly makes you a contender.
Yes, it certainly does. We saw what George Mason was able to do defensively last season, and I think that that's another very fascinating team out there in this conference because Tony Skinn over the last few seasons has done such a good job of being able to utilize the transfer portal, putting his imprint on this program, and with George Mason, I do think that even though there's going to be quite a few moving pieces from a few seasons ago, Braden O'Connor coming back is big, and I really like the pieces that they picked up. A guy, Masai Troutman, who spent the last few years banged up at Northeastern, I think could come in, make an impact. Nick Ellington, I think very much fits that, shall we say, Haynes mold from a season ago. Jeremiah Hill, who comes on over from the MAC as well. I think that these are all great pieces for George Mason, and I think that they're another one of those teams that could have a big year out there in the Atlantic 10.
Yeah, Tony Skinn was a hot name, to watch in the coaching carousel this offseason. Ultimately stuck around. This is going to be a big test because the Patriots basically lost everyone besides Haynes. Losing Darius Maddox is certainly a big loss for them as well. It'll be interesting to see how all these new transfers work because they were an elite defense. Will these newcomers keep that up? Because, they weren't the greatest shooting team at times, but because of Haynes and you look at, also they had really good depth with Giovanni Imajuru and Zach Anderson as well. They were able to just, wear teams down. We'll see if the identity stays the same with this new group, or if things will be a bit different, as well as just finding out who will be the go-to guy to watch. So I think people believe in Coach Skinn, rightly so, and that's why they're going to get the benefit of the doubt in the preseason rankings. But there's definitely a wide window of how good or potentially bad Patriots can be after losing everyone.
No question. As we do have Tristan Freeman, who does such great work over at Butts and Brackets, joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, and want to get your thoughts on the team that you cover the most out there in the Atlantic 10. That'd be Duquesne, because I think that we both agree. Duquesne had an inconsistent year last year. When you have a coaching change like they did from the previous year, that's going to happen, but it felt like they played better and better basketball as the season went along, and unlike a lot of teams outside the Power 5 ranks, they've got a lot of guys coming back, like a Jake DiMichele is big, Jashawn Corbett, who began his career over at Chicago State. I like what he's able to bring to the table. They bring in Maximus Edwards from within the conference over at George Washington, and while I don't know if this team has top 3, top 4 potential, a guy that you've seen once before in John Hughley, who ironically enough began his career at Pittsburgh, he's back in the same city. I think that he could be one of the biggest X factors in this conference.
It's been 3 years since we saw, John Hughley look like an all-league player when he was at Pitt. He's been a role player for the past couple of stops at Xavier in Oklahoma. Maybe moving down to the A-10 will allow him to go back to being a focal point inside. And they also added, 2 very interesting transfer guards, and Terrence Ginyard from UT Martin and Jimmy Williams from South Florida. Those are double-digit scorers, and they can give Duquesne, needed boost when it comes to just being a pure scorer. They had Kareem Rozier last year, but he was more of a passer and a playmaker. They didn't necessarily have guys that you could guarantee to get buckets, efficiently. And I think that's where they're going to need those two. And they also bring back Jakob Nechus, one of the better front court defenders in the A-10, who can space the floor as well. If he has a big year as a junior, as a potential focal point, that could change how big the ceiling is for the Dukes as well.
Yep, no question about it. I do think that with this Duquesne Dukes team, they are going to be in for a relatively solid year. The entire Atlantic 10, I think, is going to be a lot of fun. And Tristan, I know you're doing a great job of covering it all. You do a great job of covering all of these college basketball teams. So let the good people at home know what's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Yeah, and you can follow me at Hoopstud351 on Twitter/X, and also follow at Bustin' Brackets on all the social media accounts. And we're fully in the preseason mode and excited to finally get the preseason games going so we can see some of these hypothetical rosters in action.
Absolutely. And Tristan, he's doing such a great job of being able to dissect this great game of college basketball. So big thanks to Tristan for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiP family of podcasts. And if you do like what you're hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you do have one of 2 ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at @GUnit_81. Keep keep in mind, letter CM, the name does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline, and the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated, and then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review, and I am with you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season, probably a bunch of conference previews coming, I would say within the next 72 hours. I plan on doing 2 over the weekend, so you guys are able to lock down and you guys are able to hunker down on those, and I'll be back with you guys once again tomorrow with a non-conference preview edition portion of the podcast, and then the conference previews, those will be coming in about 48 hours. So do appreciate you tuning in today, and I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.
Warning, the following ZipRecruiter radio spot you are about to hear is going to be filled with F-words.
When you're hiring, we at ZipRecruiter know you can feel frustrated, forlorn even, like your efforts are futile, and you can spend a fortune trying to find fabulous people, only to get flooded with candidates who are just fine. Fortunately, ZipRecruiter figured out how to fix all that. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. With ZipRecruiter, you can forget your frustrations because we find the right people for your roles fast, which is our absolute favorite F word. In fact, 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day.
Fantastic!
So, whether you need to hire 4, 40, or 400 people, get ready to meet first-rate talent. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/zip to try ZipRecruiter for free. Don't forget, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip. Finally, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip.